Welcome to my channel. Like I done in the previous video, I'm trying to focus on the second leg of the Grand Chess Tour that is being held in Paris, France. This is a Rapid and Blitz tournament that this year's 2021 has attracted 10 allied grandmasters. I named them in the first video, and in the first video I showed you a game between Faroza Razor versus Wesley So, which ended in a draw. In the second game, we had GM Peter Svidler from Russia versus MVL, the number one French player. Uh, just a brief background of this tournament is that it's being held between the 16th to the 22nd June in Paris, and it has a total cash prize, which is total prize fund of 150,000 US dollars. It's a rapid and blitz tournament with rapid time controls and blitz time controls. The rapid time controls are 25 minutes for a game with a 10-second increment from move 1, and for the blitz it's 5 minutes for an entire game with a 2-second increment from move 1. So in the first round we had board 2, where we had Peter Svidler uh, taking on MVL. This is the game. Remember in this tournament that MVL is the highest rated player, with weighing in with a 2960 rapid rating. That's way high. And this must have been a very interesting game and a defining moment for Peter Svidler to try and get some ratings, much as Svidler is 2742. Well, a difference of about 200 rating. So ideally, MVL should be able to be more comfortable in this game, which did not reflect the outcome of the results. But let's dive into the game. So we had Peter Svidler with the white pieces and MVL, Vachier, Lagrave, Maxime with the black pieces. So with the white pieces, Peter Svidler started with E4, and this tournament being held in France and MVL being a French player as well, did not go for his favorite response. He normally replies with a C5, which is the Sicilian. He did not reply with that though. Instead, he thought it would be more romantic to play E6, which is the French defense, and playing the French defense in France by a French player, it looked more romantic. So Peter Svidler played D4, D5, Knight C3, Knight F6, E5, Knight F to D7, F4. Now let's take it back. This is a sideline. The main line is Knight F3. So that when black replies with C5, you have the option of Bishop G5. And you don't want to be making mistakes like so. Of course, at this level, you can't make mistakes like this. But for a 2200 player, FM11 IM, they would easily make such a mistake. This would fall into a trap, and we would have Knight B5. What this move does is it does give a one exchange, or at the very least stop the black king from castling, because this knight is looking at this G square. If this square is protected by, say, having this knight played here or playing this knight here, then you fall into a check and have the king move, denying it its castling rights. So you don't want to fall into that. I'm sure at this level, Peter Svidler and Max Lagrave knew about this and decided to go the other route with a sideline. So he pushes f4. We had c5 nonetheless. Knight f3, knight c6, bishop e3, s6. s6 is such a good move that it stops this knight coming to b5. We have a3, b5 is pushed, to try and control the c4 square, this square right here. We have bishop d3. We then had queen b6. Always belongs to that b6 square, because then you're threatening this d4 pawn. We had bishop drawing back to f2, bishop b7. We have white castling the king side, c4 kicking away the bishop, and bishop draws back to e2, g6. Here you have the bishop fianchetto to here, but most importantly, you can have the bishop coming to h6. If I can just show you, if it comes here, then you're attacking this pawn, and you're looking all the way to this diagonal. Well, that's a good move by the bishop. So we then had queen e2 to protect that in advance. We had knight e7, and the first inaccuracy of the game happened as Peter Shepdiller became so anxious to attack the king side by pushing g4. Best would have been, let's take it back, best would have been knight d1, and perhaps the game would continue this way since he had an opening advantage. He would continue in such a good way as we have that. Perhaps the game would continue like this. Yeah, and this is still okay for white. He instead played, g4. MVL replied by h5 to try and rip open the h file. We had h3 protecting g4, and then MVL played an inaccuracy by playing bishop g7. Best would have been ripping open the h file, since that was his, initial plan. You would pick that, and you would have h capturing on g4. Here you have an entire file, opened up, and if the queen or any other piece ever makes it to this file, then you're threatening a mate on the king side. We did not, have that on the board, so we then had at this point, we did not have that on board. So we had bishop g7. We had bishop g7 on board. So we then had king g2, and he played f5. Now f5 is such a bad move. You don't want to give your opponent a chance to plan in person. You'd rather play f6, so you have the option of either picking or proceeding ahead. If I could just show you that, you playing that would be really good, and perhaps the game would continue this way. That way you don't give him a chance, and you maintain your advantage that way. But that didn't happen, so he played f5, and this fell into g times h. Peter wasn't waiting anymore. We had rook recapturing on h5, then b4. We had rook back to h8. We had a4, which is another inaccuracy. Best would have been rook to g1. Rook to g1, just so you can have a flight square for the king, to have the king coming here and escaping to this side up to the b2 square. I'm sure the safest square for the king would be this square, and should be destined for that square anyway. So what happens is he played f5. He played f5 at that point. Then we had bishop h6, bishop h5. This move, what's intended for is to keep the king in the center, because it's looking at this knight. You cannot castle here without having that knight, not being captured. It hangs. castling either sides leaves this knight hanging. So that move, bishop h4, keeps the king in the center. So the knight leaves, had to release the king, and then we had f5 to evict the queen. Now this move, uh, yes, it evicts the queen, but it's an inaccuracy. Best should have been, let's take it back. Best should have been rip open uh, the a file, because you know that the his king is most likely will be castling this side. This side, it has no home. However, that was never played, and we had a5 on board. Uh, Queen c7 was played. We had bishop g5 challenging the bishop on h, which draws back to bishop f8. We had knight a2, and a mistake was played by MVL, knight d8. Best would have been knight capturing on b4. Just to show you that this is the move. Knight capturing on b4 would have been a much better move to play. However, that didn't happen. So instead, he played an inaccuracy. After knight d8. Peter played c3 to try and close up the whole position on the queen side. Best would have been knight h4, that move, and perhaps the game would continue this way, would have his advantage, you know. Oh, here he would have his advantage, queen g3, and maybe king a8, e8, knight f3. We have knight f7, bishop h4, king d7, king f2, and the king starts to walk away from the dangerous side of the board. Rook h6, and the game would continue. However, he played c3, and the game continued with knight f7. We had rook a to e1, bishop g7. We had bishop d1, knight f8. This knight maneuver is good, but for some reason, the king is still tied down in the center. It cannot castle the queen side. It will have to be a manual castle through here. So we had knight c1, knight h7, knight e2, king d7. The king starts to castle manually. We have rook h1, rook a to g8. We have knight g3, king c8, final side of the board. We have bishop c2, bishop c6, king f2, bishop f back to f8. The bishop is been moving there. That's the third time it's sitting on that f8 square. We have rook e to g1, bishop e7. Finally, it's challenging the bishop on the h4 d8 diagonal. We have h4, and an inaccuracy was played by MVL when he played knight f8. Best would have been, let's take it back, best would have been king b8, a much safer square, prophylactic move, and perhaps the game would continue this way, you know. That would be, okay for black. It would still be playable in as much as white has an advantage of, say, a +1, we say a 1 point lead, but it's playable. So he played knight f8, and Peter replied by another inaccuracy of bishop d1. Best would have been h5. Let's take it back. Best would have been h5. h5, then perhaps the game would go on, king b8, h6, you get a pass pawn, rook h3, queen e8, rook g to h1, you pile on the h file. Since you have a pass pawn, you get a blockade of the knight on h7, you have a sack, but this would be okay for white at least. However, that didn't happen. So MV after bishop d1, MV replied by queen d8. We have king e1, bishop e8, queen e3, knight d7. We have king d2, and here we had knight b8. Another naturalist was played by playing king c1. Best would have been pushing h5 again. Go create either pass pawn or open the h file. Let's look at that. Take it back. H5. Then you would have, say, perhaps g times h5, bishop times e2, queen, knight times h5, knight d7. Rook. A couple of rooks are off the board, and the game would continue. This advantage. It's a 0.8. Point advantage. But that didn't happen. So he played king c1, and we had knight c6, bishop captures on e7, queen recaptures on e7, queen d2. We have knight f to d8. We had knight g5, and then knight f7. We then had bishop f3, king c7, king b2. Finally, the king is at a safe spot, the b2 square. We had knight c to d8, a maneuver of the knights. They're coordinating really well. We had knight f1, knight c6. We then had knight e3, a centralization of the knight, knight times g5. A couple of knights are off the board. F recaptures on g5. We have bishop f7, knight g2. We have rook b8, and an inaccuracy was played here on move 49, where we had Peter Svidler playing rook a1. Best should have been h5. H5 would have been a very good move. Either you pick and exchange up a couple of pieces, and then if he does not exchange, you continue. You have this going all the way. But that did not happen. So we had rook a1, and then rook b to g8. We then had knight f4, queen e8, rook a to g, back to g1, knight e7, rook g3, rook g7, h5 is now on board. G captures on h5. We have g6. He does sack a pawn, and this was the changing moment of the game. We had rook capturing g6, and knight captured g6. Huge advantage to white. We had bishop g6, and then queen f4. This is when an inaccuracy was played by playing queen f8. Best would have been king d7. Let's take it back. King d7 should have been the move to be played in that position, but then he played queen f8. Peter replied by bishop d1, and we had king d7 now. We had king d7, bishop c2, king e8, queen g5. We had bishop getting out of the way to f7, and Peter here played an inaccuracy by playing queen f6. Best would have been rook g to h3 to try and pile up on the h5 pawn. Let's look at that. Rook g to h3. try and pile up onto this pawn, you know, and you're looking at all this, and I don't think it would be, because you would have even this other move to bring the bishop onto this, and this pawn would fall. We did not have that, though. Maybe that would play that way, but still this pawn will be vulnerable. We had queen f6 though, you know. So we then had rook h6 to try and evict the queen, and queen draws back to h4. We had knight h6, which is an inaccuracy. Best would have been queen h8. Let's take it back. Queen h8 would have been a better move. That way perhaps the game would continue this way. I would have that pawn being ganged up, and this is, you know, an okay game for black. You know, he good at, you know, he has a 0.7 advantage for white, but it's playable. It's a playable game for black. Yeah, well, that didn't happen though. We had knight c6. So after knight c6, we had Peter Svidler playing rook h to g1, piling on the open file. Rooks belong to the open file, you know that. So we had rook h7 by MVL, bishop d1, piling up on that h pawn, and then we had knight. He sacked the knight on b4, which is an inaccuracy. Best would have been queen h6. Queen h6 should have been a much better move. So that maybe would have shuffle of the rooks, rook 1 to g2. But that didn't happen. He sacked the knight, and Peter Svidler happily, you know, picked that. We then had queen capturing on b4 in check, king c1, c3, which is a blunder. Best would have been queen capturing on f5, this move, but that didn't happen. So he instead pushed c3. That's a huge blunder, and that way Peter played bishop c2 to just blockade the pawn. We had queen capturing on f5. Then we had king walking away to d1, getting, you know, to a safety zone. We had b4, which is a mistake. You know, queen b4 would have been a much better move, so that the king would be forced to play to the king would be forced to play to e2, but that didn't happen. So he played b4, and we had rook g8 check. At this point, it's a 6-point lead, and the game is almost lost. You know, we have bishop times g8. Because you don't want to be moving away. You will be met by another check down there. We then had rook capturing on g8 check, king d7, and then we had king e2, which is a blunder. That draws the game, funnily enough. Best would have been queen f6, you know. Queen f6 would have been a much better move. But that didn't happen. That didn't happen. And perhaps here the game would continue this way. He would maintain his advantage, and you know, this way. This is okay for white. You know, it's almost lost here. You know, it's almost lost. 7-point lead, but that didn't happen. So he played queen e2, king e2 rather, and that brings black right back into the game, and it's almost, you know, a drawish game here. That was a blunder, but MVL replied by another blunder. b6. Best would have been rook e7, you know, to maintain equality and perhaps draw the game, and the game would continue this way. this is drawish. This is drawish. This is drawish. There isn't much you can do here. This is a draw game. And as much as you have a piece as white, it's a draw game. But that didn't happen. So he played b3, which was a blunder, and that loses the game. The funny thing is, Peter replied with another blunder, bishop capturing b3. Best would have been bishop capturing f5. Let's take it back. Bishop capturing h5 would have been the move, but that didn't happen. So after bishop capturing on b3, we had queen b5 check. Here the game is drawish. It's 0-0. This is a draw game at this point. But players were beginning to wear down, and then the time control. Peter had 30 seconds, MVL had 47 seconds at this point. And this is becoming really a long game for a rapid game anyway. So we had rook e7, rook a8, and here MVL played a mistake by capturing b3. Best would have been rook e8. Let's take it back. Rook e8 would have been the move that maintains equality and draws the game. This bishop is nothing. It's not a piece to take at the moment. You only have 5 pawns against 2, and that way it's still a drawish game. It would continue that way. But he picked the bishop on b3, and that gave advantage to white getting into a very good endgame by playing rook s7 check, king c6, queen. He then lost the rook on e7. We had queen c2 check, king g3, queen d3, king h4, queen captures on d4 check, king g5. King is escaping. We had queen capturing on e5, and that was another blunder. It just gives away the game. We then had rook capturing on s6 check, king b5. We have rook capturing on e6, queen g3 check. We have king h6, queen f4 check, king h7, and their checks are all done. No more checks. We have king c4, queen b7, and here MVO played a blunder by playing d4. Queen d4 to try and get the king closer to the king for defensive purposes. Then perhaps you would have queen s6 check. But he decided that he should play d4, which landed into queen a6 check. We had king b3, and at this point here the game is lost. Peter is in the driving seat. In as much as we have 4 pawns for rook, this rook is too strong. It's just a matter of shuffling around the pieces, and white would win the game. We had a queen b6 check with accuracy. Then we had king c2, rook e2 check. We had queen, him giving out the queen. If you don't, then you get mated. You get mated at this point. So what happens here is we had let's just take it back. Let's imagine you play here, then you land into that, you play this, play that, and you get mated. That would be an instant mate. So what he decided was that he should give away his queen to try and fight on, but at this point it's all lost. Queen f4 check, king d2, and uh, rook captures on d2, c captures on d2, and queen d1. At this point, MVL resigned because this pawn is never gonna queen. This will be taken out. All pawns will be picked up, and that's how Peter Shevdila won his first round game against MVL. I'm sure you also gained a good number of errors, rapid rating errors. Well, thank you for watching, and we look forward to my next video. Perhaps another game within the same round, or a round 2 game. We'll look at one of the most interesting games. Please subscribe to my channel so we can be able to support kids in the hood through learning chess. Thank you.